I don't think it's a stretch to say that I've probably been one of the most vocal supporters of Marvel Snap's economic model. While there's definitely room for improvement inside of the system, I think under the right circumstances, the good can outweigh the bad and has a lot of positives going for it. But that under the right circumstances part is key. Every time I talk about how Marvel Snap's economy works and if it's a good system, one of the key things I always like to call out is the fact that this economic model really only works if balance is well maintained inside of the game. The basis of the Marvel Snap economic model is essentially that new cards don't provide more powerful opportunities, they provide varied and interesting opportunities, which means that there can't be a set of circumstances like we've often been in recently, where these newest card releases that are inaccessible to many players run rampant over the format based on power level. When first seeing how Marvel Snap's economic model was going to be playing out with how new cards start fairly inaccessible inside of Series 5, except to endgame players, I was actually optimistic that the economic model would be a boon to balancing the cards in Marvel Snap appropriately. My working theory was that they would see how these cards would play out with a small subset of players, and then they would balance those cards appropriately before they hit a wider audience and more accessibility inside of Series 4 and 3, hopefully allowing Marvel Snap to avoid the pitfalls that other card games often fall into, where a new card comes out and it just completely dominates the format, or the inverse, a new card comes out and it falls completely flat. However, as we've seen these formats play out, it's starting to feel like my optimism was a little bit misplaced, and we're seeing Marvel Snap repeat the mistakes that other card games often fall into. We've had formats dominated by Zabu and Surfer coming off of Season Pass cards, and we're currently living in a format where Shuri, Thanos, and to a lesser extent, Galactus are cards that are so much stronger than everything else in the game. In addition to these handful of cards that are too good, the opposite happens even more frequently, where these new card releases are just not good enough to be competitive, and they're just left in their state of not good enough, never being adjusted. If the entire month of January Series 5 card releases never happened, it wouldn't really matter. Even players like myself that are in the end game and spending money on Marvel Snap that have access to every single one of these cards, none of them are worth playing. Dazzler, Shadow King, Shauna, Sauron, none of these cards are contained inside of ideal decks inside of Marvel Snap. And while I definitely wouldn't want any of these cards to be punching at the same power level of things that are problematic, like Shuri and Thanos currently, for example, it's also a huge waste that these cards are just left in a state of, well, they're not even worth thinking twice about because they don't go into anything meaningful. Something that is important to understand too, while talking about all of this, is that game design isn't easy. Marvel Snap's a very unique card game, and while it's easy to say, hey, they should take the lessons learned from other card games that come before it and they should get this right the first time, I personally don't expect perfection. But what I do expect is iterative improvement at a reasonable pace, and that's not something we've really had in Marvel Snap so far. We got a balance patch recently that was targeting a format that literally no longer existed because they did an emergency patch before that one on Surfer and Zabu, but then rolled out these balance changes that they had queued up before that after the fact. I obviously don't work for Second Dinner. I don't have any insight on what their development process looks like in terms of when they schedule and time these things, but it definitely feels like they need to become more agile, forgive me the buzzword, in their process to get these things to the consumers here more frequently when there's an obvious issue that needs to be addressed. To be more specific, when I say obvious issue, I'm talking about the fact that we're in yet another Marvel Snap format now where you have to have access to Series 4 and 5 cards to be competitive. Shuri and Thanos are the two cards that are key in the competitive decks this season. And in previous seasons, if you didn't have Silver Surfer, Zabu, and Darkhawk to a lesser extent, you weren't being competitive then. It sucks as a content creator for players to come to me and say, hey, Jeff, I don't have access to Shuri. I don't have access to Thanos. What's a good Series 3 deck I can build to be competitive? To feel like, in order to be honest with that question, I have to say, you really can't be. The top decks are these more narrow things, and they have to have these key components in order to be anywhere close to ideal. In my opinion, if Marvel Snap wants their current economic model to work without drastically overhauling things, they need to be more responsive to these formats like this current one and the previous one that we're in to ensure that there is always one or ideally a handful of different decks that only require series 1, 2, and 3 cards in order to keep up with the top dogs in the format. I would love it if most of these series 4 and 5 cards were competitive and playable as opposed to Dazzler and Sentry. But at the same time, I would rather have Dazzlers and Sentries than I would Shuris and Thanoses, because if people don't have access to Dazzlers and Sentries, it's far less of a big deal than if they don't have access to Shuris and Thanoses. And again, having adequate response time and being out in front of the problem as opposed to playing catch up to it based on when the data finally says, hey, there's something problematic here, seems key to making this economic model work inside of Marvel Snap's metagames. This brings me to my final point of topic today, and that is Marvel Snap's impending new Series 5 card release tomorrow, Kang. Kang says on reveal, look at what your opponent did and then restart the turn without Kang. While we definitely can't say with certainty if a card's going to be good, bad, or otherwise without playing for it, Kang feels like a really scary design, especially when we fill in some of the details that we've gotten from Second Dinner people, which includes the fact that Kang will reset any snaps made during the turn in which he was played. And if you drew Kang the turn you played him, when the game restarts without Kang, you'll get to draw a different card for that turn. This means if Kang is drawn on your 5th or 6th turn, you effectively had an 11 card deck that game, in addition to getting snap bluff equity, potentially chasing your opponent out of the game, and getting valuable information about how their turn was going to play out. With these two pieces of information, it seems Kang has the potential to be very powerful. And to top all of this off, it's also been confirmed by Second Dinner that Kang is going to be a perpetually Series 5 card. This means if Kang does end up being a powerful format staple, it adds yet another hurdle and yet more distance between the haves and the have-nots in Marvel Snap when it comes to what does it take to be competitive and keep up. If suddenly you don't just need Shuri or Thanos, you need Thanos plus Kang, or Galactus plus Kang, or Shuri plus Kang. That is an incredible amount of collector's tokens, even for players who have made it to the end game, like myself. While I would like to again emphasize that game design is hard, and I never expect things to be perfect, I run a little bit out of optimism and copium when it comes to thinking about the future of Marvel Snap with how the balance cadence has gone. Shuri, I think, should have been an obviously problematic card after Zabu and Silver Surfer were adjusted. And even if they didn't want to proactively change Shuri, feeling she wasn't an obviously problematic card, I think she should have been a card that they were ready to make adjustments to quickly afterwards if she ended up being the case. This constant, they're waiting for their data to catch up to the things that the players are currently experiencing is tough. I would love to know from you all how you're feeling about the current state of Marvel Snap in my own little chambers, talking on Discord and Twitch and even YouTube comments to a degree. It feels like people have been losing confidence in the decisions that are being made and the rate at which they're being made. Maybe that's just a vocal minority. Maybe it's the average. I would love to know your thoughts on it down below. This is just some of my ramblings on the topic. I love the core game design of Marvel Snap, and I want to be here enjoying Snap and making Snap content. But it's tough trying to find, a deck to highlight almost every single day and realistically recommend people play something that's probably just much worse than the couple of decks at the very top of the format, which in this case currently require cards like Shuri and Thanos to play.